Hi, I'm Bree Pickering. I'm the director of the Murray Art Museum Albury, and I am speaking with artist Ella Barclay as part of No Easy Answers, our current exhibition. And we are here on Wiradjuri country, and I acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Ella.
Hi.
So great to have you here, so great to have your work. Dense Bodies and Unknown Systems, and a series of works from the Enhanced Entanglements photographs. So I'd like to start, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how you're approaching this concept of the networked condition, or where we're at as humanity now.
Yeah, it's, I suppose the understanding that we live in a networked world is something that is very deeply embedded in my practice. Thinking about what the idea of a network is also can be very broad. You know, sometimes I think when we think about the idea of the networked world, we think about life after the internet and the fact that we're all kind of connected and tracked on our phones and our movements. But equally, you know, I think long before the internet, we are all embedded within different kinds of networks, social networks, professional networks, geographical networks. And yeah, I think artists have always been really interested in understanding where they are placed in the context of other artists. And so yeah, I think that's something I've always really sort of connected with.
So in both of these works, I think one of the things you're sort of not playing with, but looking at is like concepts of visibility and invisibility, I suppose, like what we see, what we know, and how that shapes how we understand things.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Dense Bodies and Unknown Systems is a series of 3 massive tanks of water that have got mist in them, and then there's projected video onto the mist of lots of different figures swimming around in these really lurid sort of misty oceans. And the figures in this case are just kind of multiple versions of me in kind of, I think, very unflattering nude coloured underwear, swimming around at Civic Diving Pool in Ngunnawal country in Canberra. But yeah, the idea of seeing and not seeing in technology is something that I've always been really interested in. If you think about looking at the figures swimming around in these misty waters, you can sometimes glimpse figures and sometimes can't. It depends on kind of the undulations of the mist. But that idea of how we look and think about technology as things that we're both seen and unseen, I think is kind of really interesting, and where spectacle sort of resides in that space. A lot of people look at my tanks and think they could look a little bit like server farms or big humming computers, and then when you kind of peer into them, you sort of be like, hey, there's like a weird bubbling wet mess in here, and there's sometimes like figures going on, like you can see figures in there as well. And I think it speaks a lot to, you know, the idea that when we say the internet or we say the connected condition, there's no clear singular image that can best sum that up. There could potentially be diagrams, or some people might think of like Facebook or Instagram, but that's not entirely encapsulating. So we're constantly dealing with the knowledge that there are these systems around us that we can't necessarily even grasp or conceptualize or see. And this isn't necessarily a new thing either. I'm sure, you know, the telegraph systems, the radio systems, the electricity grid, even road networks and things like that also exist in these kinds of spaces of us knowing that these systems are around us, and we as humans rely on systems around us, but we can't necessarily see entirely what they are all the time. So yeah, thinking about some of those ideas, I guess, is definitely what comes into my work. But also the idea of, I guess, visions and invisibility, linking it, you know, there's the beautiful Laudanum series by Tracy Moffat that is existing in the space on the wall next to my work as we come in, and that's a really fascinating series of works, I think, that, you know, is to do with sort of colonialism, but is also to do with kind of, it's very gothic horror, and it's based, I think, it taps a lot into the idea of spectres and ghosts and being haunted from other times and haunted from other power structures, and it speaks quite nicely to my work, I think, in drawing these connections between, the ghostliness, ghosts in machines, whether or not the weird forms that we're all kind of imagining or that could potentially manifest themselves through different kind of, AI models that we're seeing, etc. And where our own fears as humans and what we imagine and what's really there or not, and where that comes into play is also an interesting idea. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I like that. I also think about actually when we're talking about your work and making those connections with Tracy's series, and there are other works in the show that have sort of aesthetic connections, but how aesthetics are kind of constructed in that space of the visible and invisible, and how we might imagine, the inside of a server farm, as you're saying. And they could be like these spectres and ghosts, but I think what's really amazing about your work and lovely about your work is that there's a real embeddedness in social, cultural and art history as well. You're looking back over time and looking at the way artists have actually responded to the world over time, rather than about the rules of art history, but looking at artists itself. So maybe my question there is like, how do you go about like building an aesthetic or the aesthetics of our world now? Who's in control of that in this kind of networked world that we live in, and how do we make space for art in that?
I wish we knew who was in control. I think some people would have some very defined answers around that. I wouldn't postulate, I don't think. But so it's, I really think we should do away with any idea that the artist is somehow a very solitary figure who just works with themselves and the medium. I think having been practicing for 20 years and a lot of my dearest friends are artists, etc., and really understanding, even though our practices can all be very different, we're all very, very deeply embedded with each other's practices and how we work and sort of assisting each other. And I think really being an artist is so much about understanding your place and your connection to, other artists and other histories of art, both at the same time as you, but also kind of throughout history. And I think that's probably true for time immemorial. I think you look at a lot of really fascinating First Nations practices, etc., often to do with kind of networking and pointing to other places where art is going on or other systems, through to, even the kind of Renaissance artists, etc., I think is kind of an interesting idea. I'm always coming back to Vasari, The Lives of the Artists, which is essentially like the first art history book. Vasari is someone who, worked on the Uffizi Museum, did a lot of things, but the first art history text is basically kind of almost like a gossip column for how the artists were living. So it sort of almost really is less about what people were making and more about how different artists were interacting with each other.
I want to talk about maybe the materials of your work. I'd say you're a pretty serious thinker. You're an academic, you're a teacher, but there's a hell of a lot of joy in your work, I think. It's really... it's very fun to experience. So just looking at how you incorporate and why that is important.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the materials of mine, it's very easy and often very seductive, particularly when you're an artist working with technology, to really chase the newest, latest thing, whatever that is. At the moment, I think everyone's going really gaga for kind of... AI designed imagery, etc., or kind of generative, adversarial network works and things like that. But a lot of my work is like, I kind of joke, but I mostly use entirely 20th or 19th century technologies to make work that sometimes can look quite weird or quite futuristic. But it's also super experimental and kind of messy and sloppy, and I kind of really enjoy playing around with that. So yeah, the Enhance Entanglements photo series, if you look at these works, they're big photographs, they're neon colours, it looks like lots of swirling patterns, and it looks almost like it's computer generated imagery, but it really is actually just a bunch of silicon LED neon cables and some black plastic that I've melted with a blowtorch, and just I've shoved a camera in there, and I'm just taking photos of the different colours bouncing off the kind of reflective black plastic. So it's actually point and shoot photos, but they look somehow like something else.
Like really manipulated.
Yeah,
techie photos.
And you know, I think because we're humans and maybe it's our deep embedded kind of superstitious nature, but you look at these photos and you can see all these faces popping out at you. You know, I think it's called pareidolia or whatever, where your eyes just will look for faces, and so suddenly you're starting to think, you know, what are these strange creatures? Are these potentially kind of, you know, ghosts visiting us from kind of the computer world or something else, or is it just a sort of a reflection of ourselves? But I advocate, you know, I'm a lecturer and researcher at ANU, and the art school is amazing there, and teaching young artists to kind of be experimental and to be weird and to let the materials to work through the materials and let them do what they want to do sounds like such a weird, clumsy methodology, but it's actually where a lot of power, I think, in art comes from. It's like maybe having a plan, letting the plan go off track, following your gut when it goes off track, and seeing what sort of comes out of that is kind of a really interesting methodology that I think other levels of innovation, like I think computer programmers and all sorts of people are now starting to look at these kind of methods of, you know, material somatic knowledge and seeing what comes out of this, instead of a sort of really, really tight, we're going to make this and here's how we're going to make it and we're going to get to this point and it's going to end up exactly as we planned, but instead really seeing what happens along that journey. I think Roy Ascott calls it like poetic technicity. So it's this idea of really just seeing, you know, what you do with your hands and how that can move around, etc., and what can kind of come from that. But yeah, chasing weirdness. Weirdness is kind of your friend, I think, with all things art, and it's where everything good kind of happens. And I love, actually, often I find some of my favourite artists who are artists that try not to be weird at all make the weirdest work, and that's the best. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that approach is actually kind of reflected in a lot of the artworks in the show. There is a real connection with materials, but there is a lot of experimentation across across the works. Probably Tracy's are the most formal, I'd say, but in the way that she constructs the works, there's a lot of looseness, and she works with not with actors or models, but just ordinary people. So maybe the looseness and the experimentation is happening in that making process. But I was just thinking back to the enhanced entanglements works and the faces that pop out of them. What I saw first was actually uterus.
Do you know you're not the first person to say that to me? A lot of people have been like, the uterus works. And I'm like, a lot of people see uteruses.
Which I think is really, really interesting, given that you are looking at kind of feminist histories of technology, and there's so many ways to, like, you know, the monsters and the uteruses and the, you know, I mean, just the way that all of those things could come together in kind of a really like positive sense, or could be kind of turned around into like a, you know, negative kind of connotation of the monster and the uterus together. But
there's there's a lot in it. The more we look at the history of technology and the history of computation, the more that we see it's a really deeply female research trajectory, and that's often been kind of overlooked for lots of different reasons. But, you know, early computers were very much based on looms and weaving practices, lace making practices, the difference engine, which is one of the earliest prototypes of a computer, which was worked on by Ada Lovelace, who's the illegitimate daughter of Charles Byron, but not Charles Byron, Lord Byron, not Charles, but Lord Byron. There's a really strong kind of feminist history. Even, you know, we were speaking earlier about, say, you know, the first sci-fi novel was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and the kind of there's just a really long history. And I'd also say possibly non-binary or genderless interpretations and contributors have also been very rich over the last maybe 200 years. And it's like unpacking a lot of those things and kind of demasculinizing technology is something that I think can only help all of us. You know, I think there's a lot of, you know, when we talk about increasingly automated systems, everyone talks about the fact that if the data sets that we're feeding computers for machine learning are based on colonialism and sexism and racism, then we're only going to continue to manifest colonial, sexist and racist futures. And so the more that we can critique how we're collecting data and what the history of those things are, the better. So yeah, it's great that kind of there are uteruses in my work where you can kind of see that. But yeah, it's kind of deep. I mean, it's really, you know, I think there's a lot of really interesting, and there's a lot of amazing contributors and feminist contributors and researchers in this space as well. But it's something that I think is, yeah, really kind of compelling. But I think as well, this is like the messiness, so enhanced entanglements and also dense bodies and unknown systems are kind of messy works to look at. And something I found really interesting is like, I've been making work for, I think messiness is sort of a instinctive aesthetic of mine, but it's also something that I caught. But, you know, I remember, you know, being a younger artist and being told by older curators that I need to tidy up my work. And that's actually a super sexist thing to say. That I think is it's really interesting, this idea of understanding technology as being something that's messy and not necessarily going to be like a clean kind of Minority Report style kind of arts making space. I don't know, I think there's something feminist in there. I can't quite articulate what it is though.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And that does go back to what you were saying about teaching experimentation. And also how we conceptualise beauty. I mean, we were talking a little bit about beauty before and you leaning, starting to lean more into beauty. I also just think that sometimes people are looking for a beautiful artwork and that might mean to them something that they understand as beautiful or that has been determined over time by a certain set of ideas to be beautiful. But actually, what I hope that they'll start to do is think, okay, but how did I come up with that concept of beauty and try and find a new idea of beauty in a more complex way of like making things, bringing ideas together with different materials and actually find, as you're leaning into beauty, that there is actually a deep kind of beauty in letting go of things that we thought we held dear for some weird reason.
Yeah, I think you know, I kind of almost feel like kicking myself every time I do it, but I find myself returning to looking at sort of romanticism and the romantic movement of the 19th century, of which you know, I think Mary Shelley was a part of as well. But you know, within romanticism, you know, there's something so earnest about this earnest pursuit of truth and beauty, but also this idea of the sublime, which is sort of this idea of something that is terrifying and awe-inspiring, but we are kind of seduced by the vastness of it. And I think, you know, a lot of ideas in art kind of always come back to that. And I think romanticism, even though in some ways I think it's just such a poncy movement, but a lot of it was also about being critical of new technologies, being critical about the Industrial Revolution. In some ways, romanticism was very reactionary to kind of just this idea of endless process, but also became such a success because of things like the printing press and mass production of photography and etc. So yeah, I think a lot of these ideas, particularly when we think about technology, you know, we're drawing on a pretty old, deep pool of the ways that we have reacted in the past and how we may continue to react. But it's good to have these toolkits with us as we move forward. I think particularly, you know, I think the next 24 months, we're going to see leaps and bounds that are going to possibly be quite frightening in terms of, you know, processing speeds, network activities, how we locate ourselves, how we're tracked, how we relate, how work will change, how social relationships will change. And I think sometimes it's the weird art that we have that hopefully can give us some weird kind of spirit guidance in that space, even if it is just about looking at, like, you know, weird neon ponds.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. Get ourselves some weird neon ponds to survive the oncoming technological nightmare. I'm all for it.
Thank you so much, Bree.